did you notice about that opening part?
It starts it starts in the basement of the voice and kind of remains there, which is very beautiful and effective. But the first thing is that the onsets of "We all have a star," all those beginning lines were very breathy. Um, and that breathiness kind of carried throughout all the low pitches, but as soon as the voice climbed a little into the E, F area, the tone started to clear out and sort of like that tunnel of sound became, it sounded more connected. And I definitely feel that that was a stylistic choice. Having breathiness of quality is not always a sign of bad technique or under singing. Sometimes it can be very deliberate and very effective.
She sings this in the tenor key, the original key, because
Mhm.
the song is originally by Wilton Felder. And so something I think that is interesting is so these same notes like F and E and all of those, where do those same notes that are in the basement of a woman's voice sit for the male tenor?
Oh boy. So it's such a that's such a very good question because every singer is individual. And there are no hard and fast rules about, where a particular voice type is supposed to sit all the time. But what I will say is that, you're singing the same pitches, but there is a very small, minute difference in the musculature of a typical male versus a female voice that will then make the sound like worlds of difference to most people's ears. So here, with starting out in this basement area, we all have like those notes. Those are also um, in the lower middle for most tenors. So between what she's doing and what a tenor is doing, there really is not much of a difference in terms of the placement. What I will say is that the tenor will probably have a few more notes lower, like down to a C, sometimes a B, very rarely, but sometimes a B. But that difference is about, I want to say, that's like a third of a difference, like the C, like a third or a fourth of a difference. Typically in female voices in this area, the change, sort of the switch between the head and the chest and the mix, all those things, it can sound much more pronounced mostly because typically in keys by higher voices, they're not going to be spending a lot of time in this area. So, the higher you sing, the lighter the mechanism has to work.
Okay, so I want to play the next part of these 1 second.
One good night on high, you see much more than you ever.
So something I noticed is that really as she sings below A flat, it tends to take on a breathy or airy quality, which would say that around G, A flat would be like her last like good money low note. So something that I thought was interesting, like just hearing singers talk or, in my brief career as a singer, but something that I thought was interesting is like, while a lot of people like to focus on high notes, many have said it's actually harder to sustain singing lower.
So one thing I also wanted to point out is that the three low Fs that she's saying, we all have It Shows Who One Good Night, because it'll clarify what I'm about to say later. When she came in for One Good Night, the F was clearer than it was the first two times. And that to me made me immediately believe that she was making stylistic choices. Not that she's incapable of projecting below an A flat, but that for what this song calls for, the breathy quality would have served her more, which in a tenor voice, typically if he were to sing breathy in that area, it would not be received in the same way. It would be received typically as some maybe a vocal defect or something like that. Singing in general requires this balance between dark and light colors, this counterbalance, these push and pull forces. But in order to sing low notes and be heard properly, it deceives people because they would think that because low notes typically are, they reign in the chest area where most people's speaking voice is, that it'd be easier to do. When in actuality, you have to resist the urge to beef up the musculature in your vocal cords when singing low in order to be heard. Whereas singing high, for example, it's not that it is easier, because it's not easy for everyone, but singing higher pitches requires a little bit less work on the actual muscular mechanism. You sort of have to allow the breath to carry the sound, kind of like on a springboard. It just sits in a different place resonance-wise, but with low notes, that lighter approach to the mechanism is not going to work, because you're using a different set of muscles. That actually makes it easier to deceive yourself into thinking that you can just kind of like, I guess, shout or yell into the low notes or into the chest, and that'll make you be heard. But in actuality, you're actually harming the actual vocal development more, because no one's going to get that clarity of sound until you learned to properly use the breath to negotiate those lower muscles.
And speaking of the breath equality, I guess what I would say, like, at least to my ears, it sounds like a stamina thing, is because I'm trying to think of One Good Night on High. So that's F. One thing that I think stuck out to me, and why I think, like, maybe the key of this song could have been raised if they were going for like a more even quality, is to your point about sustaining, like, one good night on high. So she starts on F, ends that entire phrase on E flat. So that is very low. But one thing I noticed is in these very low phrases, like, she can start with like a full sound, but then like it loses steam at the end. To your point, I've heard of like tenors who say it's very hard to just stay down there, you
Mhm.
know. And when I think about women in pop music, or even, any genre of music, a lot of women will like have those notes, but none of them are staying down there. So I guess from here, let's just take a look at her singing some of the same notes and see if, like, um there's a difference in quality, or how, like, what comes before the note impacts what actually happens on the note. So, like, that's when I think the low note was that it sounds like an F. I need to get that notated. Or I'll play another one. So instead of starting on F, the phrase is resolve on F. All right. So what do you notice about that?
In this one, she visited the low tones. She didn't stay in that realm. It was sort of a touch and go situation. And that lets me know that the crux or the meat of her voice is not in the basement. She's on the heavier side of a mezzo soprano. So a mezzo soprano is a soprano. She is a kind of soprano. Her voice just sits more in the middle. Doesn't mean she doesn't have the top, but it also does not automatically mean that she is a natural contralto, and can like live in the low tones almost at an inexhaustible rate. So yeah, so in comparison to We All Have a Star, which was written for a different voice type, it sits in those areas because that voice type can handle it and can be heard clearly, simply because the vocal muscles are just slightly thicker, and that thickness is measured in millimeters. It's not like comparing the branch of an oak tree to a willow tree. It's not how you do it with the voice. But in this one, she was very smart because she knows that her power to sustain below a certain point and to communicate effectively is limited in that area, which is why she would touch it and then sail right back up, touch and sail right back up.
Which I think is really interesting because when you just think of really any voice type, really, it doesn't matter what you are. Like, of course, there's the range and then there's the tessitura, but once you get to the end of the range on either end, that's usually how, even for the high soprano, you go up, come down, or for your low note, you start high, go down, come back up. And I think just the way she approaches the low notes is similar to how like other women in her genre of music approach the bottom. They touch that low F, come back up, or touch that low G, come back right back up. It was Carolyn Sabron who said this to me. She said a lot of people like to focus on the note, whether it's that very high note or that very low note, but it's actually the notes that come before it that are the most important.
This is a really interesting conversation as someone who started out as a tenor.
Really?
In order to, when you have particular notes that you know are important in the phrase, like at the end of a phrase or if it's high or low, you must have a semblance of the pitch in the pitch before it. This is something that I was always taught by my teachers. And what I noticed that Vesta does here that's really beautiful, before she goes down to that low pitch, it's the pitch right before it. She gives so much energy and meat to it and uses it as a jumping off point before it's a that was so beautifully placed, very clear, and it allowed her to reach the lowest note and be heard on that microphone without the breathiness that we heard in We All Have a Star, which wasn't written for her or a voice type. You know, the notes themselves aren't really where the mystique lies. What's really important is how each voice approaches them, and what are the unique capabilities of each voice to sing the same pitch, but have a different approach in the musculature and in the expression of that pitch. For example, a lot of tenors and a lot of altos, they share an octave off all the time, often. But, you know, a high C for a tenor in an operatic context, or even in a gospel context, like Rance Allen, for example, high Cs for tenors, like bringing the chest up, you know, that C there is nothing for a mezzo or a soprano to sing loud, soft, what have you. Same exact pitch, but the difference in the voice type creates the difference in the musculature, which then creates the difference in how it is approached. And all those things are really important to consider when you're writing music for certain voice types. And so if you're going to sing something that was written for a different voice type, you're going to have to do a lot of renegotiating. If you're not going to change the key, if you're going to sing in that original key, you will probably have to do some renegotiating for those things. I think that if Vesta had been a true low contralto, not a mezzo, if she'd been a true low contralto, We All Have a Star would have probably sounded different in her execution. Still beautiful, but those things are always on the table to consider.
What we heard and We All Have a Star, it sounded amazing, but that was work still, just on the other end of the voice.
Yes, it was work. It was work to stay down there and to communicate effectively, which is why in We All Have a Star, as soon as she ends her last lowest phrase in that part of the clip before she goes on to So Strong, Much More Than You and I, the emotions of the song, they expand, not just by the text, but by the way the actual music is written. And then she also is a bit more vocally free to really express what it is that she's trying to do. Whereas with all of the low pitches in the beginning, those are more, I honestly really do feel that it was probably a good way also of getting her to warm up the voice to be able to do those things later. It's just more difficult when you're constantly in the lower end of the spectrum, or if you're constantly in the stratosphere all the time. One thing my first voice teacher always told me was that, you have a wide variety of notes in your range, but where your voice lives is what makes all the difference. So you can have low Gs, you can have high Bs, B flat, Cs, whatever, but it does not mean that that's where your voice wants to stay all the time. And that's where tessitura comes in the conversation.
Okay, because I mean, if you think about the ending of the song, was where she goes, "You more than you and I." So she's on B, C, D flat, B, C, D flat, B, C, D flat. And if you think about any of her other songs, like Congratulations, Congratulate, I think that's C or D flat. So she, at any of her music, she wants to find her way to that area. From a singer's point of view, what does it feel like when you are singing too low for your voice?
Pain. It's immediate discomfort. Almost like you feel the vocal mechanism almost like being stretched too thin. But it's also the same sensation that I've gotten when singing too high. It's the same sensation for me, at least, on both ends of the spectrum. And I will say that singing low, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I am a male soprano. So I started out training in the tenor octave for a number of years before eventually I realized that it was actually very vocally uncomfortable. And, I had a naturally high placement. I didn't really experience a voice break throughout my childhood. So, I had access to the higher octaves and I could sing up there comfortably. So when I decided to make the switch, what happened was things that I used to think were so high became part of my middle voice. And that changes the psychology of how I approached the actual art of singing. When you're singing into one end of the spectrum, You can feel a general lack of support. And even if you sing it well and people like it, if it's causing you discomfort, you should stop. Because the only person who's in charge of these two little things in here is you. It's not anyone else. And I think singing too low can be detrimental, but it doesn't get talked about as much. Whereas singing too high, the conversation about vocal damage is almost always about people singing too high. But
Tony
singing too
Braxton.
low can cut off your resonance from other parts of your voice. And you can also do what I used to do was to, in order to create sort of like the masculine tenor sound that everyone was looking for, I would artificially beef up my vocal cords in order to make more robust sounds in the low. But it actually was very unnatural. And I noticed that I couldn't get through a full recital without suffering a vocal breakdown. There was an excess of phlegm on my cords. There was sometimes pain on one end of the chord, and I had to stop because I was like, I'm going to give myself nodes if I don't stop.
And so I think, the conversation about singing too low is really interesting, especially when you consider like, I think of somebody like a Miss Braxton, like sings a little bit too, and you can't understand anything. But if you compare that to a lot of the girls today, a lot of female singers, I don't necessarily hear with men per se in pop and gospel music, but a lot of these newer R&B singers, they sing very low. You can't understand what they're saying, but also a lot of them are having vocal injuries and they aren't even singing over an octave. So I think that's a really interesting,
Because
discussion.
yeah, because in order for them to do that, when it's not actually natural for them, they aren't getting enough chord closure. And that's where the excessive amount of breathiness comes from. And also they're blowing too much air through their chords to try and make this really earthy sound in the low when their voices don't want to do that.
As singers, you can't always see everything for the most part. You can see a lot of things, but majority of it is inside, and you're relying on hearing. So, what is an audible sign that a song or someone is singing too low for where their voice wants to be?
I would have to say breathiness. The breathiness is a telltale sign. And also sort of this, anytime that I've heard someone singing too low, what happens is the sound starts to go back. And it creates, in certain voices, it can create this frog-like hollowness. And it just sounds uncomfortable. Breathiness and the frog-like hollowness are probably the two telltale signs that someone is singing too low.
Okay, so on that note, I actually want to replay We All Have a Star, and you just point out where you feel like that transition or where you can hear something of that. 1 second.
We all have a star shining clear and clean. It shows who we are and what our lives can mean. One good night on high.
That sort of back tone, like when she first starts out, we all have, that initial low F starts from such a raspy place, and the sound has this rattle to it that you don't really understand what the actual word that she's singing we, but by the time she gets to have, which is a much more comfortable position for her, the actual beauty of her tone is allowed to have more freedom. Then when she transitions from it shows who we are, that before she goes from the C to it's the C to the B flat down to the A. Between the C and the A flat, you can hear the mechanism shift. And once again, it goes back into that breathy place. Ah, 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 instead of ah. And then again, with the E flats, the low E flats, it
Yeah,
goes back.
okay, so I think what's interesting is a phrase that I also want to pay attention to is what our lives can mean.
What our lives can mean.
I don't know what is different about it, but that ends on EDC, A flat as well, but everything was even. And I wonder, is there anything she did differently? Because everything else, again, afterwards is just air.
Yes. So what she did there, she stayed in the initial position. She didn't change. So when she did the it shows who we are, that breathy position stayed all the way through to what. And then after she sang what, there was an immediate change on the exact same pitch on the next word. And that is some very swift vocal changes. That's actually very difficult, but she did do a small reset when she took that breath. What our lives can mean. It was so much clearer because she started in she basically she kept her voice in the same position. Typically, I mean, you would say in the up position, but this was not in the up position. She didn't feel the need to use the chest by making her support fall back. And that is what actually made the sound come forward on what our lives can mean, because it was the clearest that she'd sung in the entire beginning of the song. However, that also might have been a stylistic choice because that phrase, what our lives can mean. Yes, it does go with the poetry of shining clear and clean, but what our lives can mean is the first time in this particular song where the actual meaning of the star is brought into focus. So automatically, from an interpretive standpoint, she would want to bring her voice forward more, have it be less breathy, have it be more clear.
And again, because that line, as we like sort of kind of covered, another reason she's able to do that is because, as we have seen with a few of her songs, A flat is like her good, loud, low note.
Yes.
Okay. I know someone said outside of it being harder to sustain the bottom of the range because it's an extreme, they also said when singers maneuver the bottom, they like to change. You call it the position, some people call it the placement. So like they just shift. They've heard singers miss low notes because they changed the place where they were singing it from. Like it can be mid word, the same word, but even just on the same pitch. They're like, let me, I don't know, do blah, 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 because I need to do blah, blah, blah in order to sing lower.
And typically when you're switching like that, that's a thickening or a de-thickening of the mechanism. Which is not something, and that's also typically done, in a way that it's kind of off of the breath. It's more of a muscular change, and that muscular change will cause you to reset, and then you can stack stale air on top of stale air, and then you get the breathy quality that you don't want in those low pitches.
All right. Okay. So thank you.